So, welcome everyone. I'm joined here by Eros. This is going to be probably a sort of short discussion on what I touched upon in the incredulicide video. And me and Eros, that entire video was sort of started by a discussion me and Eros were having, a written discussion on this idea that Eros brought up regarding basically weaponized disbelief. Are they trying to almost intentionally make these events, these theatrical psyops, um, sort of unbelievable, so to say? Do they want you to have distrust in the government? And he mentioned as well with the hantavirus that we are in such a state now that it almost we're almost ripe for a mass culling, some sort of spectacular um, sort of biowarfare agent or whatever it may be, foisted upon us because, of course, we we, we're in this state of what would you call it? Radical uncertainty, radical disbelief. We wouldn't know what the hell to do. We don't know, up from down, left from right, and yeah. So I'll let him sort of give a brief exposition of his views upon that, and yeah, we'll take it from there. So, hello, Eros.
Hey man, how's it going?
Very good, very good. How about yourself?
Good. Hanging in there, hanging in there. Yeah, it was a
Living
good
the dream,
conversation
mate.
we were having the other day. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
if you want to give a sort of brief exposition regarding that idea, and I thought it was very, very profound.
yeah. So I was just thinking on it, and a lot of what my basis is in a lot of philosophy, so I'm gonna kind of get into that area there, um, regarding the whole idea. But when we're talking about psyops and propaganda, black propaganda, these the black arts as it's known, um, a big part of that is um really it's layering deceptions, and you have to sort of work from a disposition of it needs to be almost an objectified position where truth and falsity, fact or fiction, you can play with both pieces. A lot of times, the standard sort of like human um model that we have for the world is that we think that things are very solidified in categories of truth and error, in fact or fiction, um, and we place little things in each box, and we move things around back and forth. But for the most part, it's fairly stable. Now, there's we live in a world, as we've mentioned before many times, that there are threats to your being, to your subjectivity, to your person. And that could be like a wasp nest, that could be a car coming at you. There's a million mundane things we can talk about, but we live in to add on top of those basic dangers like tripping and what have you. We live in a predatory environment, and it's a competitive environment, and there's also a competitive situation amongst humans. And so the as I had mentioned before in other videos, humans have this we're extremely dangerous beings because we have this ability of abstraction. And through the process of abstraction, we're able to conjure worlds of belief and narrative. And that's what humans do. What we do is our minds, we look at the world, we look at the phenomena that we experience, we can abstract into our past. So we can look at our past, and we, in terms of our memory, have these various points that we can remember, and we use that information and we organize that information into systems of thought, and we use those systems of thought to navigate the world and to identify threats. So when you're a little baby, you don't realize the stove is going to hurt. If you put your hand on it, stove's on, put your hand on it, you burn it. Oh damn, you remember that, right? Unless you can learn from instruction, you're going to have to touch the stove to learn physically that it's hot. Now you've identified a threat, like, right, too much heat can be painful and can harm you. So there's a very critical process that humans have to go through, and that's like being aware of their environment and learning how to interact with that environment. And part of that learning and awareness of the environment is the identification of threats. And when once that the threat is identified, your body is going to assign usually some amount of fear to that threat, or at least a hyper awareness or a hyper uh, um, attentiveness that you'll give to that, right? So I'm sure once you're attacked by a bear, right, hiking in the woods, and if you survive, there therefrom, if you go out in the woods again, you're going to be hyper vigilant around anything that could be signs of a potential bear in the area, right, in your presence. And this is just the natural human disposition, and we're really, really good at it. We're really, really good at being afraid because of our ability of abstraction. We can remember events that have happened with great clarity. We can coordinate these things, and we build narratives off of these things. So, being narrative builders, it gives us great survivability, but at the same time, it opens us up to the possibility of high amounts of deception. And that's because what we essentially have, if you look at things, is take it from a historical perspective. The way that history works from a subjective perspective as a human is that you have events that have happened in history. Yesterday, I went to the store, I drove my car here, I talked to my wife about this, whatever it is. So these are like particular events. Now, if you remember back, let's say 2 weeks ago, what happened on last Thursday, you might be able to pull a few events from that day, but unless you are extremely gifted in certain in areas of memory, some people have this savants, but it's very, very rare. You are missing the interstitial um, causative relations between the events. Yes, I went to the store, but I only went to the store because I ran out of milk, and I ran out of milk because I spilled the milk, right? So these are the interstitial events that are in the causative line of time 2 weeks ago. But what happens is that it's for most of us too much information to hold or to correlate or to remember. So we only have the events. So I've used this illustration before. A fetus, if you look at your hand, we'll summon Kant here, and we'll we'll look at our hands for some philosophy. But um, in the womb, the fetus, when it's growing in the womb, the as the hand develops, it's primarily a web at first. It's like a webbed appendage. And what happens is that as the fingers, the digits grow, they emerge out of the web. But what's actually happening is that it's not just that the fingers are positively growing, it is also that the interstitial webbing between the digits is dying. Okay, so those cells, those skin cells that make up that webbing, are receding, and the digits are growing at the same time. And then you have the emergence of the fully formed hand as the webbing recedes. So this is essentially how our memory works. This is how the universe works as well. It's very deep here, the cosmos. But maybe we'll touch on that another time. But just for this aspect of talking about hantavirus, how this gets the hantavirus and this whole deceptive ploy that's happening here, is that when that interstitial space is removed, it's an absence. There's a void right between your fingers. You have five fingers, but you have the voids in between those fingers where the webbing essentially used to be, but it died, and now the fingers emerge. So if we use this to understand our how our memory works, is that we'll have specific events right in history, and those are like the fingers, the digits that have emerged. But what we're missing is all of the causative relations that are between the events. So what we do as humans, because we are we try to bring order and system and logic, right, and organize everything that we do, is that we spin narratives, right, between and we speculate um, between the events to connect the events, so we can have continuity between the events. right? So in an archaeological dig site, they'll find a pot, and then they'll find like a hammer, and then they'll find, a basket. And these are events, right, historically. And then what we do is they'll weave a narrative and say like, oh, must have been a hunter gatherer tribe moving through the area, and they were an Inuit people because see this symbol on the pot means. And so what they end up doing is they build a narrative for what happened 3,000 years ago at this specific site to help bring continuity and understanding explanation to help organize their world and adapt to their world. Well, the same thing happens when we're dealing with the conspiracy world, or we're trying to figure out what's happening with the hantavirus or 9/11 or what have you, is that we have specific events and we become aware of these phenomena, these specific events. But we were always missing um, that interstitial narrative as to the cause and effect about what's actually going on. So we have to speculate. Now, there's nothing wrong with this process, right? Per se in itself. And I think this is where people can go too far to one side, where they say like, well, narrative building is a bad thing, right? Narrative building, interstitial building, um, for continuity is a negative thing. Not necessarily so. You do it all day. You do it constantly. You project it into the future. Do it in the present moment. You pull it from the past. So this is just what it means to be human. What happens though is that we become susceptible to um, that entire in that process of narrative building. That's where deception can come in. So how this relates to what we were talking about the other day is um, what can end up happening is narrative building in itself, and this is the objective, and I think what the elite are trying to do here. Narrative building itself needs to be completely deconstructed, and it needs to be taken out of the hands of the common man and reserved for only the pool of the elite, where they can weave their own narrative. And the way I think that they're doing this is encouraging conspiratorial culture. And like you had mentioned, making a lot of their operations, a lot of the things they're doing, blatantly obvious. And what this does is they sort of lay out the digits, they lay out the events for you in a very obvious manner so that the interstitial causative connections are obvious. They're not explicitly stated, so they're occulted. And what humans do, our natural drive is to look into the occulted area and try to find and establish what the causative relation is or was or will be. And so they want us to look into those areas and build the narratives. But what they're doing is they're making these causative connections very obvious, right? And then what this does is they're sort of revealing their hand, but it's a feint. What it is it's they're they're putting on a show, a spectacle of psyops with just enough of sort of that keyhole open for you to look through, so that you have to dig for the interstitial causative relations, but you should be able to find it. But what this ends up doing though is that what you they make it obvious what they're doing. They show you their psyops, and they show you again and again and again and again. And what this does is it begins to build a meta narrative, a hyper object, if you will, of narration itself. Because then what ends up happening is you get, like you mentioned, great terms, right? The auto hoaxer, the auto denier, the nothing ever happens crowd, right? Where they say basically everything is a hoax, everything is a conspiracy, everything is a psyop, right? And so we can't trust anything that happens, that is said, that is taking place. So because the interstitial narrative is shown to be deceptive again and again and again and again, what ends up happening is that you completely abandon narration itself. You no longer are can no longer establish any interstitial connection between events, causative relations between events, because it's immediately sort of denounced as hoax or propaganda or what have you, right? This is essentially like a postmodernism to the extreme, but applied to the conspiracy world, because it has become so deconstructed that the events themselves begin to become like illusory. We don't know what's happening anymore. We don't know if anything is actually dangerous. We don't know. And what this does is it completely disables one of the primary functioning aspects of your intellect, of your mind, and that is the establishment of causative connections. It disables that entire process because you cannot see any interstitial connection. So
Hmm.
then you become completely malleable at that point. So it's sort of like a meta psyop is really what it is, because what they're doing is they are using psyops to establish a dominant psyop situation that locks you in a position that's essentially unfalsifiable, right? And it's sort of like a nail in a coffin where um, once you have got into that sort of feedback loop of essentially auto hoax, there's no way out of it, right? There's no way out of it, because any evidence that would be presented can be immediately dismissed, right? Um,
No,
if
it's
you
an
want to
ortho.
jump in, go ahead, because I'll
It's
just
an
keep
or-
talking.
No, no, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting point there. And I remember you brought up that analogy from Kant regarding the digits and the webbing between them, this interstitial webbing. And I totally agree. It basically is an orthodoxy of negation. And, you know, of course, this is something that abounds within conspiracy culture. I mean, really, you could take any, some of them which are just blatant psyops. I mean, for example, the flat Earth. That is a blatant psyop. You know,
Hmm.
I'm old enough to have lived through that. You know, overnight the thing was beginning to be. It went through this algorithmic virality where people were just pushed it, and so again, these things were almost setting people up for distrust, and like what you're saying as well, it's almost so blatant. The you know, these sort of made for TV events, right? And the acting is completely inauthentic, clearly so. Moreover, as well, the connections that we find, for example, let's just take Jake Rosemarin on their, you know, the recent hantavirus thing. You don't really have to dig too deeply to see his connections with, for example, Israel, his sister's connection with that of global health, pharmaceutical companies, virus and crisis management, and of course his husband as well has connections with BlackRock, and
Mm.
yeah. So I mean, these things are almost laid out like this, and it's like what you're saying again. This was preparing the minds of this sort of conspiratorial black hole, which over the years has pulled more and more particles to it, more and more corpuscles of the population to it, and ultimately, though it appears, again, that it's rather ingenious, it appears as though you're going through this path, connecting
Hmm.
all these dots. Even if you expose the dots, I mean, it's still mentally or abstractly you're connecting them. And you're going through this pathway and you're not realizing that you're being led down the garden path. It's like what you're saying, they want you to reach the point where you become, it's what I call terminal discernment, or this
Mm.
orthodoxy of negation, where ultimately, like what you're saying, you're so terrified of reacting to these things, um, you don't realize the connection between reaction and proactivity, um,
Hmm.
or proaction. You don't realize that you firstly have to react to the thing to thus kick your survival, you know, what would you call it, sort of the predictive survival engine within your mind, kick that into high gear, and to begin to sort of figure this out, right? So ultimately, what ends up happening is, like what you're stating, is you lose the ability to craft narratives. In fact, it's almost, if we tie this in with AI, it's almost like you're being turned into this solitary island within the middle of a vast ocean, this digit between the interstitial formless voids between you, right? So you ultimately become this multiplication of zero by zero, this more insect than man. You actually become almost like Nietzsche's last man in a sense, um, because you lose the ability to craft your own culture, your own narrative, because everything within this source of echo chamber that you've constructed, this curcurbit, this alchemical containment chamber, is that only this exists, and everything out with it doesn't exist. So ultimately, it's hyper individualism, it's hyper atomization, it's what's known in Kabbalah as yechidim. You become one of the yechidim, which is the literally solitary unit.
Hmm.
You have no ability for community or connection, or not even talking about human to human connection. I mean, you don't have the ability for that either if you take this to its extreme, but you don't necessarily have the ability for even abstract connection either. You lose that ability.
Exactly. Exactly. It's essentially a form of like a solipsism, right? Where because what ends up happening is because the cosmos, everything is one in terms of it's all related, it's all connected. It's not one as in terms of an individual being. Not everything is one thing, but everything is interstitially connected. And what ends up happening is that if you can take a mind and you don't cut it off by force, is that you have that mind auto generate its own dissection out of the interstitial matrix of reality. Each person, from their perspective, becomes cut off because, in order to maintain the connection, it takes two like nodal points, right? Or two like concrescent points, to bring a little bit of Whitehead here, and they have to have a relation between each other. They have to have an interactive relation, which is governed by Eros, right? Which is governed by this magnetic attraction and this communication, this dialogos, this dialogue that you have with the world. It's not just human to human. It's me and the tree. It's me and the air, the temperature of the environment. It gets down to that nitty gritty level. But where what we're talking about here is, yes, this interaction between everything, the causative web of history, but also of the present, as it is on like the wave of history, right? As connections are rhizomatically spreading out and establishing new vectors, and those vectors are interacting in terms of like dialectic interactions. And right, this is Nietzsche's will to power, will to life, of this all these different perspectives moving in this general direction and interacting and relating to each other. Well, you become cut off, or the process begins at least of being cut off from all that, because if you know, are an auto debunker of everything, right? And this is driven primarily, one of the primary drivers is honestly a deep seated fear, but also a hubris, right? A sort of a pride, in the sense of, you know, you're not going to fool me. I'm not getting fooled again. Right? You see this in all the comments, right? Don't get fooled again. Don't get fooled again. Fool me once, right? Shame on me, right? Um, and so you see a lot of this too, because people don't want to be duped. And it's not so much, some of it may be that they don't want to be duped, you know, because they're trying to preserve themselves. And I think that's coming from a bit of a better place. But a lot of it is shame based, because they got duped on other psyops and they don't want to be duped again. Um, and so what it's ultimately driving towards is this position of an auto blindness, where you cannot see causative relations. And if you can't see those causative relations, and we're dealing with an asymmetrical predatory environment situation, what's going to happen is that you lose your ability for threat detection, because threat detection is based on the interstitial causative network, right? It's a relation. The predator prey is a relation, right? And that relation requires the detection of the relata, right? The thing which is related. You have to be able to detect what is a threat, and then you have to do an analysis on how much of a threat it is, and then make your decision to respond to that threat. But if um, every threat is sort of immediately or very quickly dismissed as psyop or conspiracy, or we have to dig really deep on this before we can figure things out, you have to be careful. You don't want to auto react, right, based off of preset systems of thought and whatever paradigms you've been subjected to. But at the same time, you don't want to never react, right, to anything. And where this ties into Hanta is, just to use that as an example, is that if this or another soon to be method of depopulation is actually employed, whether you want to say it's a virus or it's 5 or 6G or it's activation of nanotech that has been placed in you previously, whatever you want to say the cause is, doesn't really matter too much. The point is, though, is that if if this is a legitimate threat, are we being prepared, and have we been prepared to say, it ain't nothing, go about your business and don't worry about it,
Well,
because we're auto debunking everything.
well, there's another point, and sorry to interject, but there's another point there to sort of highlight, which is that this entire auto debunk, or nothing ever happens, or whatever term we want to use, this orthodoxy of negation that you see throughout conspiracy culture, that itself also it almost has this predetermined this presupposition, this idea at its heart, which is that it affirms almost tacitly that the system does all of this um, because it's still thinking on the old paradigm of a human centric system. When you begin to look at, for example, the data center build out, all of this infrastructural build out, look at the energy prices, look at the talk of this idea of energy shortages. They're even, of course, as well. I believe in places in the US, there where data centers are being built next to residential areas, that the residents of these areas are being told, by the way, we will not be providing you any more services here, water and what have you, because all of that's being diverted to the data centers. So what this appears to spell out as well is that depopulation is on the cards, almost almost definitely, because they're thinking on a different paradigm from us. They're thinking along the lines of a post-human society, or at least a post, what they would call overpopulated society. So we have become a resource competitor to them. So everything that they are doing is to trap us into greater and greater degrees of prey behavior and domestication, which is, of course, what this is. The only way it's what's it called, the I forget what the psychological term is, but it's an effect where you effectively allow the person to connect the dots. This is how ARGs work, alternate reality games, or you place the breadcrumbs in front of them, and you allow them to find these breadcrumbs, connect these dots, find this clue, whatever it may be. And what it does, even if at the end you tell them, by the way, this was all an ARG, it was all designed, they still have this sort of they get a dopaminergic high at each
Mhm.
certain nodal point where they get the clue, and there's almost a neurological imprint that's fashioned in their mind that makes them fiercely defensive of that thing, because they believe that they found it on their own accord, you know.
Hmm.
Um, so, of course, as well, that's also what you find in conspiracy culture. And by the way, that's why conspiracy culture is also highly orthodox. I'm going to be very polemical in stating this, and I'm going to say that all of this, everything you see in the alternative media, in the fringe spaces of thought, which is becoming less and less fringe by the year, all of that was probably funded and cultivated by the system itself, almost undoubtedly.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I wouldn't stray too far from your conclusion there, because the powers that be know that with the extreme connectivity that the internet allows for, that people are going to talk, and humans are always concerned about, well, at least up until maybe recently here with this situation, but threat detection. It's a huge part of being a human. It's a huge part of being a biological organism, is the avoidance of perturbation, right? So it's a big chunk of our lives. Our brains are literally wired for it. And if you can take that um, deep, deep, like reptilian deep part of the brain, that deep wiring for threat detection and avoidance, and you can use that to build and guide narrative, it is very difficult to overcome that, because it's deeply seated, right? It's deeply seated. If we're told that there is a that there's a cabal who's going to depopulate us and what have you, which right, which absolutely can be correct. But what that does is it initiates the adrenal response of threat detection. Then they begin to like lay out breadcrumbs, um, and then you follow those breadcrumbs, and it's almost like a hero's journey, right? Where you feel like you're figuring it out, and you're going to be able to save your tribe if you can figure it out. These are deeply seated, especially for the masculine perspective. These are like deeply seated drives that we have, and it's very easy to manipulate us at that level. Now they manipulate us at like the level of like desire, right? Whether it's sexual desire, desire for food, or desire to obtain security. You notice that all the greatest manipulations happen at the deepest levels of what it means to exist, essentially. Those are the most effective ones. So we have to look for where those manipulations are coming in, the vectors where they're entering at those areas. And we have to be careful with it. But it's walking a tightrope, it really is, because um, they are constantly they're so well developed in their predatory skills that they will, faint, 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 faint. And what they're doing is they're essentially making you punch drunk, right, off of an overabundance of information and all of these different conspiracies. And look at this, the number 33, the number this, the number this. It's here, it's here, it's here. But they make stuff like blatantly obvious. I mean, I remember during the Trump election here in America, where I'm sorry, where Biden beat him out, right? And they had like all of the cheating in the voting system and stuff. That it
Yeah,
was all over the news. I'm sure you remember that
yeah.
in the areas where they were voting, they were like putting up like cardboard over the windows so
Oh
people couldn't
yeah,
see in.
yeah. They were putting up
And so
hoarding and that, and I mean, it was so unbelievably um
yeah,
clear. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and everybody's like they cheated, they stole the election. They didn't want anybody to see and stuff like that. It's like they were instructed deliberately put up the cardboard, and reason why they were put that stuff up, so that you would then connect the dots and say they're trying to hide something. What are they hiding? That they're stealing votes and they're cheating to get Biden in. And that was all done so you can have the massive whiplash reaction and the jerk back towards Trump to get him in, have massive support to get to where we are right now with the Iran war and the data centers, right?
exactly.
Um, right. So that was done for that purpose, and they didn't make it explicit. What they did is they let you connect the dots. They let all the conservative MAGA people connect the dots and say, "Oh, look, look, oh man, we're cheating. Oh, ha, ha," and then
And
it's
and
like.
And also the
Go ahead.
QAnon ARG as
Yep.
well, just to point out that too.
Yep. No, they're brewing that, getting that all in there, and so that's for the purpose of that's what I'm talking about. These meta levels, the meta levels of psyops, right? That they're building. And here's another example. And this is fortuitous in terms of timing. My youngest son, who's in third grade, he came home the other day. You're gonna love this. You're gonna love this. He came home the other day and he said, "Daddy." I said, "What's up, bud?" And he's like, "Do you know about the Illuminati?" Right? And I was like, "Oh, where'd you hear about that?" And he said, "Well," he said, "there's on my school, at my school, they have this app or program. It's like a portal through which they, like I mentioned to you before we started recording, everything's on the iPads now and everything's digital now. But one of the programs that they have through which they play like these math games and stuff, and they have this program that has these like that will read them books and stuff. Well, one of the new ones he says that popped up there is something, I forgot the name of it. It's like amazing questions and answers or something like that. And there's an entire tab, an entire section, which I, without a word of a lie, is conspiracy theories. And literally, it's telling him, it's giving him just, the basics on the Illuminati. He said, like, they were talking about stuff about 9/11. He said, like, Isaac Whitesop or something like that. He couldn't pronounce it right. And then, like, the Americans, all the people who founded America were Masons, and they like the number 33, and all this other stuff, right? And again, nothing too deep because it's a little cartoon AI character talking to him, but you can see that they're seeding into an 8-year old's mind, which is highly inquisitive, highly observant, right? They're seeding in this idea of the conspiracy theory, right? as a as a heuristic device, as a guiding interpretive device for the world, is the idea that everything is a conspiracy, and so you can't trust any of the events that you see unfold, right? Because there has to be like a layer of conspiracy that happens. Now, there are a lot of layers of events. This is obvious just based on the very nature of the human mind. You don't have to study conspiracy theory. All you have to study is some philosophy and some neuropsychology or what have you. Understand that humans can be deceptive. So there's always a conspiracy that's happening somewhere when humans interact in a competitive environment. It's just going to happen. So that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the hijacking of the idea of like narrative building, and that narrative itself cannot be trusted. And what this does, what we are chatting about before, which sparked this conversation, is that what this does is that it lowers your ability for threat detection and response. So what this is doing, as you mentioned, is it's actually who you would think would be the most prepared or the most able to handle a situation of um, a hierarchically elite set of humans, or others, even non-humans, whatever you want, however you want to mix that up there. But this group of people who are actually massive threat to 95% of humanity. What it does is it puts them in almost an indefensible position, because the people who would respond to them actually become disabled by the inability to construct narrative anymore. They actually, it clouds their vision and their ability to see the connections between things and then to respond to the connections between things. And it either sort of like gates them into a very certain, they're looking for something very specific. I'm just waiting for the reptilians. That's the big thing. Everything else is a distraction. It's just the reptilians. So they're going to get gated into like very specific orthodox, like you said, viewpoints and answers for what's happening, or they just completely lose the ability, right, to discern. Right, to discern is to not just negate everything, but it's to use the power of negation to separate and to move things around and organize them. Right, they lose the ability for discernment because they've been stunned basically by this process of this hyper negation. Um, so they're
Oh no,
starting them from a young age, you know?
I mean, that is absolutely jaw dropping, totally jaw dropping. But it just shows that the system has become so totalizing that it actually commodifies its own critique. It wants to actually bring about distrust. And I noticed as well, I wasn't really young enough to, pardon me, I wasn't old enough, pardon, to sort of, latch on to the conspiracy culture, in sort of post 9/11 and that, but, the early sort of 2000s. But by the early 2010s, I was on YouTube watching those sorts of old, I guess you would call them old timey conspiracy videos and what have you, hour long, discussions and things like that on all of the various books. And I would go and find the books and read them on the players, I guess. And that started with Alan Watt and then sort of grew out from there. And what I recall from back in that day, though it was beginning to sort of come to a head in terms of them bringing in the orthodoxy of negation. It was sort of slowly simmering at that point. See, what they started doing was, I would say, from probably the 90s to the 1990 to 2015, give or take. You could even include the Satanic Panic in with that. So you're talking about like the mid 80s all the way to the 2015. You had this sort of a this dot connection. They were building out the mythos that now has become the sort of like what your son's talking about, this sort of typified quintessential mythos that surrounds the conspiracy culture. But eventually it almost led everyone to a sort of classic learned helplessness state, this allostatic overload, right? This you're overloaded by the burnout of fear. And this induces that learned helplessness. But then, of course, that would feel like a loss, and you would have like a. Eventually, people would just, due to the sort of apathy and the depression of this echo chamber, that would feel entrapped, feel like entrapment. Pardon. Eventually, their ego would feel so crushed that they would want to just leave it. Right? They would just drop off. There would be a fall off, massive fall off rate from this conspiracy culture. But then came along this sort of orthodoxy of negation, right? Let's just call it that, or the auto debunker, or autoimmune hoax conditioning, as I also call it. And so what that does is it's almost a way for the ego to be protected. It's like an ego defense mechanism because it feels like a victory, right? It's again, if you just connect the dots and you see, for example, the system is just wanting to depopulate all of mankind. It's this interconnected serpentine, this sort of uh, behemoth or leviathan that's this hydra that we can't necessarily defeat by normal through normal means. It's this sort of almost superhuman or supernatural foe that we're up against. Again, that leads to complete complete helplessness, right, against this sort of gargantuan system, this overshadowing system.
Yeah,
However, with the orth
it makes you a perfect prey animal.
e-
Yeah.
exactly, but with the orthodoxy of negation, it's what you're almost doing is inverting all of that. So you're saying the system is actually weak. Everything it does is fake. All of it's phony. All of its shadows. All of its illusions. As long as I just don't look at them, they won't harm me, right? And it also, as well, protects the ego because you actually almost feel like a genius. There's like an intellectual pride with it because you feel like you're
Hmm.
seeing through the specters, the phantoms that are being projected by the system itself. And therefore, you feel that your inaction isn't necessarily helplessness, as you would with sort of, as we stated, that classic learned helplessness, just connecting the dots, right?
Hmm.
Therefore, it's a sort of it's a strategic It's a strategic refusal to play the game, but you're doing it not to strategically beat the system, but to actually protect your own ego. Because
Hmm.
ultimately it's a fear, you have a fear of reacting to it, because if you react to it, then you almost feel like you must physically act, you must physically resist. But if you don't react, or you have this idea of the orthodoxy of negation, where you feel like the system is just all fake anyway, everything you're seeing is fake, therefore your inaction itself doesn't trigger that response of helplessness. It protects, it's basically, it insulates the ego from that feeling of helplessness. I mean, it's rather, I mean, it's amazing. It's almost like they've commodified a critique of the system into an orthodoxy or religion where people
Hmm.
feel empowered while they're totally powerless. I mean,
Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
amazing. It's
That
genius.
that that's yeah. That's what I'm trying to get at is that, and what I mentioned before, like in the server, is that we have to think like the predator. We so like if I was them, what would I want? I would want them to feel supremely powerful and be actually utterly helpless, because then they cannot help their helplessness, because it is ipso facto dismissed, right? So, and that's what I mean. It's almost like a double bind where it's like you can't get out of that system, because if there's any kind of call to action, whatever that consists of, it's just auto dismissed. It's the same effect that you get with dogmatic religion, right? It creates this sort of unfalsifiable position where you can't argue against. Here, I have an argument against the doctrine of the Trinity. All right, here's this argument. It's pretty much foolproof. Like, here you go. They're going to go through some amount of cognitive dissonance, right, to dismiss your argument off the bat, right? Well, you could spend hours arguing with a dogmatic religious person, because in the end of it, they're going to say, "Well, I just have faith that the text has been, uncorrupted, and that it's my ability to interpret it is sufficient." Right? And it's like, well, I'm going to show you how that's wrong. Well, it doesn't matter what you say, because I dogmatically a priori assume that my interpretation is correct. It's literally, there's nothing you could do. There's no vector, there's no argumentative uh, discussion that can happen at that point. So then what actually happens is it's that dogmatic person is disconnecting themselves. So here's that disconnection we're talking about again. That's what these dogmatic positions do, is they isolate you in a solipsistic perspective. They disconnect you from the other perspectives and vectors of the world, so you no longer progress. You become a self-sustaining um, feedback loop within yourself, and you maintain whatever status quo you have attached to, and any exterior influences that would come and say, hey, maybe we should, have you ever considered, are automatically rejected. So you have an atomized individual um, who can't be interacted with in any kind of way that would get him out of that spiral loop into himself, that is sort of inward collapse into this solipsistic viewpoint. And so what you've done is you've made him completely helpless. This is like the spider, to use illustration. It's like the spider webbing up its victim, right? The spider will bite the bug, inject a paralytic toxin into the insect, and paralyze the insect, and then wrap it up in its web, and it's still like technically alive. It's not decomposing. It'll slowly decompose, maybe through the injection, but still it's essentially alive. It's just isolated and cut off from the world. And in that process, it's sort of given this opiate narrative, right, where it thinks that it's saving the world. I have the vision. I took the red pill. I can see the code in the matrix, and I got the answers, and I'm here to like rescue everybody. Right? It's sort of like the hero's tale. And when in fact, because as you pointed out, you have these like almost like two dialectic dispositions of how the conspiracy world has come to be formed, where in both positions you end up helpless. And really that's because, and this is I think at the core of the issue, it is an abdication, it's a giving up or a handing over of your um sort of sovereign power to create and to weave narrative, right? Um, it is like Nietzsche said. Nietzsche was always talked. He wanted to be a yes man, and by that he meant he wanted to be affirmative in his philosophy. He wanted to um, be a sub creator of the new, right? To weave the narrative of the events of the world and to push forward towards like let's say like his conception of the Ubermensch, because that's what the Ubermensch does. The Ubermensch is um what makes him Uber is that he's not taken by all these other narratives. He does not he is able to navigate through all of the traps that have been set to induce learned helplessness, and you have to have the vision to see it not just as a standardized learned helplessness, but also as the learned helplessness that can come by disability, self inflicted disability, and inaction, right? A retreat. It's not just that you're being led into a pen of helplessness, but they can get you with the helplessness by having you say, hey, just sit here down in the field, put a blindfold on, say everything, is a conspiracy, and I can see the truth. We're good to go. And the pack of wolves is coming, but you just sit right here and just you think that you're safe, right? So it's it comes down to the individual person having to navigate their world um, for themselves, right? You can't just hop onto every train that goes by that sounds like it's good or fulfills some kind of instinctive drive for you. You have to be sovereign, at least to some degree.
No, absolutely, and also as well, regarding your analogy with the spider, it's almost the sort of what you saw in that sort of given period of time that I stated with the sort of first stage of the conspiracy culture, which is all of the sort of the tendrils or the of the thread that was being wrapped around us were all of these various major events, and the beginnings of the conspiracy culture, all of the threat detection itself, and then after the orthodoxy of negation, what that did is almost it induced. We reached a point of epistemic exhaustion, you could say, and then and
Hmm.
then it induced that sort of hallucinogen, right? So we were pricked by the fangs of the spider. It induced this paralysis, perhaps even a hallucinogenic compound, and we went into this sort of strange, uh, wonderful hyper reality where we feel as though, like what you're saying, we've pierced the veil of the system. We feel powerful, while of course we're powerless. And I mean, ultimately, what this also ties in even beyond the conspiracy culture with social media. People, for example, won't they won't ask their neighbors or their friends for help. They'll ask Gemini or AI, right?
Hmm.
They won't they won't go out to eat. They'll get Uber Eats or what have you. They won't vent to a friend about an issue that they're having. Um, they'll they'll post something on social media, whatever it may be. And what this is doing is it's actually increasing the legibility of the citizen, um, based around these sort of reactive events, right? But even what they perceive, what the orthodoxy of negation perceives as non-reaction, is in fact itself reaction. If you don't look at the shadow, that's still a binary input into the
Hmm.
system. you're still providing the system. Well, you're still sort of elevating the system in itself, right? Because what
Yeah.
you have to, you're not necessarily navigating the environment. You're effectively stating, well, I'm not looking at that, right? And you have to really try to not look at it, rather than look at it, process it, and then just simply, if it's complete and utter hogwash, move away from it. Don't react to it. But non-reaction itself is still a form. If you just don't look at it, that's still a sort of form of reaction, at least in terms of how the system would mathematically account for it, right? In terms of
Yeah.
their algorithms, and again, it's all based on legibility. They want people to be based in these dogmatic sort of funnels of society, that these categorizations that the system has set up, because this allows them to model these people, model these categories, these groups, and basically put them into an algorithm, an AI, so that they can be legible 24/7. So they know exactly, can predict exactly how this person will react. So ultimately, the social media itself is a hall of mirrors. It's People believe, even in the non-reactive state, people believe that these things that they're seeing are they look at them as though they're either real or fake. That's the sort of position of the orthodoxy of negation. But to get beyond these things, like what we're doing here, we are viewing these things as, how are they trying to relate it to us? How are they trying to get us to react? How are they
Hmm.
trying to perhaps to get us to non-react as well in this case? So
Yes. Yeah.
you're looking at the shadows not necessarily as, as fiction or non-fiction. You're looking at them as signatures of the system itself, and how the system itself is seeking to interact with you. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. This is. Let me just state this emphatically here. Um, if you are a being in the world, or as Heidegger says, right, Dasein, if you are a being in the world, there is no non-participatory disposition that you can take. That's that is an illusion. Because even if you say, fuck it, I'm gonna go be a Buddhist monk in Tibet and I'm gonna sit on a mountainside and I'm just gonna eat tea leaves and meditate, basically until I die. Your absence from the society affects the society. So even if you aren't there, the negativity, the lacuna that opens up by you retreating to the woods still has some small measured effect because you're in the world and you're connected to the world. And like Heidegger says as well, his idea of sorge or care, the fact that you care about anything means that you are participatory. Okay, even your inactivity is a form of activity. It's just an activity that is in the form of a form of negation, essentially, where you're negating activity, and that process of negating activity still affects things. So there is no being in the world. There's no existence without um, activity, without interacting with the world. Okay, so let's just get off the table from the get-go that there is some position of like not playing the game. Well, I'm not going to play the game. By not playing the game, you're playing the game, right? All you're doing is disabling and you're taking yourself out of certain narratives, out of certain frameworks, out of certain interactions, but you're still going to interact, right? The only way to not play the game is to walk through the door of death, essentially, right? And then you may still play the game after that. We don't know maybe how you would play the game, but you still could very well be interactive after that. So you're gambling there and guessing that even through that doorway that there it would be a form of zero interaction. So let's just bracket that off, from the get go. So if you are going to be interactive with the world, if you are going to participate because you have to, because you exist in the world, then the question is that participatory power that you give into the entire matrix or web or network of interactions between all humans and all events and all occasions in time as you're participating, like in that butterfly effect, right? If you're going to participate, how are you participating? That's the question, not whether or not we will participate. That's going to happen. So, how will you participate? And that's what the goal is. They tricked a decent portion of the population to think that there is a non participatory state, that you can back out of everything in toto. And then the rest who don't do that, they can get them into a non-participatory state by like distraction, right? Bread and circus or what have you, where they're basically non-participatory. They're still producing money and or revenue or what have you for the state, but in ways that can genuinely or drastically affect the world, they're not very participatory. And then everybody else they seek to essentially canonize into dogmatic silos that they can move around basically as chess pieces. So you're going to participate. Are you going to decide how you participate, or are you going to let somebody else decide for you? So once again, we're right back at that central position, the sort of Hegelian Nietzschean position that I keep kind of I keep sort of emphasizing, this Promethean position where you have to forge your way, right? As best you can, obviously, but you have to take hold of the rudder of your ship. Now the winds are going to blow, and the sea is what it is, and the rock formations are what they are, and you don't have the world is not completely plastic at your fingertips where you can modify absolutely all phenomena, but it's you have to realize that everything. Well, we won't say everything. That's going to go take us on a different path. The powers that be understand that everything is participatory, and what they want is to colonize your participation to fit their what they see as their hierarchical view in terms of the vector that they want to go, and it's a harnessing of humanity's participation, mental, physical, spiritual, body, soul, and Geist or mind, and they're harnessing all that. And I guess from here we could tip off into something which we won't now, but I mentioned this to you the other day in a quick chat that I want to get into this sort of body, soul, mind, um, just viewpoint on things, kind of coming from a Clausian framework there, but then launching it somewhere else. We'll have another discussion with that. Like I said, I've got to gather my thoughts on that,
Mhm.
but this relates directly to that because what this is that this is they are essentially playing off of this triangular. The geometry is going to be important here for our next talk on this, but they're playing on this triangular relation between body, soul, and mind, and working that entire system. And essentially, if we give over any of those aspects, we are going to be taken for a ride. And you can be taken for a ride, is my point here with this little diatribe. You could be taken for a ride on the train that's called non participation, just as much as you can be taken for a ride when you try to kick down the door at Washington, D.C., because we're going to storm the Capitol or whatever else they thought they were going to do, right? They got taken for a ride. But there's many ways to be taken for a ride. So we have to be very careful
And
with that.
also as well, I don't want to keep you too long. How long have you got left,
Let's
man?
see, what time is it? We could do maybe like another 20, 30 minutes or so.
Oh,
If
brilliant!
you got
Right.
it.
Well, there was
Yeah,
something
yeah.
I was looking into with Clagus's work, and he calls it Entverkling. Oh God, let me get this in my
Your
notes.
German's brutal.
Entverklickung, Entverklinkung, or Entverklickung, which is the derealization of the world. And
Hmm.
he discusses that in relation to builder or images. And I was wondering, does that tie in with what we're seeing right now? Because this idea of the derealization of the world, this int Verklickung, I was looking at this a couple of nights ago, and I was like, this must tie in with ARGs and everything we've got going on right now, and also of course like what we're talking about with the AI. system, and James C. Scott, another author that I've been looking into recently, has really profound work, Seeing Like the State, I believe it's called, and he discusses in that most civilizations, imperial systems, and what have you, systems of human domestication, they collapse because they effectively are they're powered by what he calls metis, and that is a Greek word meaning like a type of ancient wisdom, a very quaint understanding of the world, and it, it has within it this realization of culture, of art, of human expression, of basically the flame imperishable expressed out into the manifestable world. And he stated that eventually the system itself, because power is as power is, it wants to demarcate and to categorize and to effectively narrow down and to control this unquantifiable variable of the system. But that unquantifiable variable itself is what basically keeps the lights on within the civilization. It's what powers the civilization, not just physically, but also in an intangible way. And again, it seeks to measure everything. This is the idea. And so I was thinking upon this, and with this notion of, like, for example, what we're talking about with the conspiracy culture, it almost literally, well, it literally is a derealization of the world based upon um, the sort of the images, the events that we see and with process, and it's almost a way to tolerate a sort of unpredictable reality or perceived unpredictable reality. So again, it's another trap. But I don't know. Do you have anything to say upon that? I also think Clagus mentioned that this is related to the Geist. It's almost the primary weapon of the Geist as well. And does this tie in with what we're discussing here?
Mm. Yeah, it does a bit, and it's gonna it's gonna kind of cross right over. I can tell we're kind of ready to get into this level of this discussion, but it's a crossover to what I was talking about, where I got to correlate more of my thoughts on in terms of realizing this, because like I said, I mentioned to you, I was thinking about Thales, the Greek philosopher, and how this sort of relates into all of this in terms of looking at the Clagisian framework of body, soul, and spirit, or mind, or Geist. Um, and what Claudius is talking about with like the derealization of the world is that like the there's essentially a buffer that's placed between us and the world through Geist, or through the mind, and the images, the builder, or the early builder, the primordial images, or the ancient images, are sort of the if we talk about it in a the way I like to picture it is like in a scientific term of using like Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields, is essentially what in a physical sense Claudius is talking about, how there is a nimbus. He uses the term nimbus, right? Like around a living object, right? Like a tree, right? It has a nimbus, it has an aura to it, it has an image that that impresses itself. I forgot the German term. I think it's Schaum, but it impresses itself upon you, right? Upon your soul, your receptive faculties. It impresses this specific image. Now, this specific the image is specific, and by that is meant that it is an image, um, a that is impressed upon you in time. And what that means is that since time is constantly flowing, it's the Heraclitean flux, everything's constantly changing, which means that as the image of the tree impresses itself upon you, that specific tree to your specific person at that specific time, that is like a once and for all time event. Okay. And that's like being in the world, right? Is that things like, okay, again, this goes deeper into what I wanted to talk about. But we have essentially, we have uh, cycles and events, right? So we have like processes and we have events that happen. And the processes are like the cyclic revolutions that we're able to sort of pick out or discern by Geist, like of the world, like the rising and setting of the sun, right? But the rising and set of the sun is never exactly the same because of the flux. Everything's always changing. So as we sort of progress through time, each event that happens is an event that has never happened before, nor will it ever happen again. What Geist does, though, is what Geist it takes the builder, the image of that event, of that specific, very particular, unique experience that you have, and it takes that and abstracts from that event um, particularities through the process of dissection, right? So through the process of basically um, dialectical thought, right? The division between two different things. It so the green of the tree, the summer breeze that blew through the tree when you saw it, the person you were with as you were walking and you saw it, the cloud in the sky that was in the background of the tree as you perceive the tree, right? These are all in a unique situation. That's the builder, that's the nimbus or the aura, or we can go deeper into the occult, right? And we could say that this is the spirit of the place communicating to you, right? And this communication is received in this very unique situation. Geist takes that and it abstracts from that the commonalities and the differences, and then it pulls that out, holds it in reserve in sort of like the memory, and then it can apply it to other things not immediately present in the world. So then the world is derealized in its
Yes.
immediacy, right? So its immediacy is lost through the abstraction process because abstraction pulls it out of the flux of time, holds it in reserve, and then it can apply it to other things. So the green of that tree, while the green of that tree was a unique greenness because who I was when I saw that tree, the position of the sun, the wind, holding my wife's hand or whatever, and it was all a unique experience. That experience is abstracted and then applied in different environments. So it creates a level of a step, at least one step of removal from the present moment of that flux in time. So that's how the world is, in Clogis's view, derealized. Now, for me, and this is where I wanted to head eventually in terms of at least explaining my view on things. For me, I at least currently I'm always open to correction on this stuff. Love to hear anyone's critique. But for me, I think because Cloggis is very like he laments this condition, right? Because this is our birth, um, our sort of ripping out of the womb of the world, right? Where that's what Geist does is that we are pulled out of the immediacy and interaction of the world, where we were body and soul, and then Scott Claugus says that Geist comes in and creates that third element. Claugus bemoans this. His their guy said that Vita Sacra de Sela, his 1,500-page work is a lot of very detailed argumentation, but it's a lot of lamentation over this process. For me, I feel like it's kind of um, like crying over spilled milk, right? Like it's like, okay, well, we are beings in the world with Geist. That's the third term, body, soul, and spirit. And there's nothing you can do to be rid of that. Even Claugus says that you can't go back. You can't go to just body and soul, right? So because we have this third term spirit. So now, how do we wrestle with the weight, the pain, right, of the Geist that derealizes the world in its immediacy? Like, okay, ipso facto. See, that's the thing. That's what I mean by like, there's no not playing the game, right? That's why I say like you have to shut off Geist entirely. You literally have to disable all thinking processes and return, if this would be possible in some way, to a simple, a pure bipolar, right? Sort of like engagement of just body and soul. You'd have to erase all cognition, right? And so, unless you're willing to do that, right? That's why I say everybody's playing the game. There's no not playing the game. There's no not participation because you will abstract. Sure, in the moment, you can enjoy that tree in the field on your hike or whatever you were doing. And in that moment, it makes its impression upon you and you receive that impression. But what you will do is abstract it because that's automatically what you're going to do. Right. And so, in terms of trying to, let's say, apply this to what's happening here, is that these are the Trinity, these are the three aspects that the powers that be manipulate: body, soul, and mind. By manipulating the body, right? Biodigital convergence, poisoning the food, all this other stuff, right? Um, they can manipulate the body, which then um, can weaken or modify the connection that it has to the soul, and the soul is like the receptive, um, sort of like, we'll say container. It's kind of a bad word for the images, right? Because Klages says one of his famous sayings, which is I think is pretty much right on the money. He says the body is the expression of the soul, and the soul is the meaning of the body. Right. So what that means is that the body, as you being in the world, as you interact with that world, your body is the primary way that, because that's how you are in the world. You are in your body. You're embodied.
Hmm.
Right. And but the Geist, then this is where I come in, because Klages is like away with the Geist, but I'm like, well, wait a minute, there is no away with the Geist, right? Unless we like commit the extinction of humanity itself. And if we're not going to do that, then Geist is here. So now how do we harmonize body, soul, and spirit? The powers that be are looking for a disharmony of body, soul, and spirit. And if they can't establish a disharmony, because a disharmony will disable you, you'll end up in a position essentially of a learned helplessness, because they can disconnect you from the soul, or they can hijack your Geist, right? And that's primarily what we're seeing with the conspiracy culture. It's a targeting of the mind, of the Geist, by putting them in a defenseless state. So they seek to amplify, to like energize or de-energize the soul, right? And they can do that through images, right, of like extreme violence. They can do that through different means, like sexual images with pornography, where these images impress themselves upon you into your soul. Then that soul gives the meaning. Then that soul will begin to, it's the meaning of your body. It'll express itself through your body, and you can begin to get sick and have these other issues, whatever. Specifically with pornography, right? Like erectile dysfunction. They see this like, oh man, I have ED because I watch too much porn. Well, that's because the soul has been impressed by too many specific images that are put out there for that reason. So they can attack the soul in that way. They can attack the body, but they can also attack Geist. And with the conspiracy culture in that framework, they're essentially targeting Geist, because Geist is a massive driver for humans. We are intelligent beings, and so if they can get into, now the Geist is it's an intense battleground, because that ability for abstraction, as I've said many times, is an extremely powerful tool for which you can use to create beauty, art. You can do all kind of stuff with the abstraction, but it can be a wasteland of deception, because it is derealized from the immediacy. And because it's that one step, at least, removed from the immediacy of the world, it has the ability to allow for deception, because it is not the event itself. It is the narrative and the construction of the interstitial experiences of the events. The events are like the builder, the images that are pressing themselves upon you. The interstitial causal relations, um, or what Geist can see, and it can pick those out, and it can see the connections, and it can say, well, perhaps if these events were interstitially connected in these way, perhaps these events over here can also be connected in those ways. And what you can do with that then is I can say, hey, this rock kind of looks like, you know, my Uncle Sam. Well, let me take this rock and let me build it in the same shape. And you can let me take Uncle Sam's image, his builder that he has impressed upon me from his soul, and it has impressed itself upon my soul. Now I have that image within me. Let me take my abstract mind, pull that image out because I remember that experience, and let me recreate, subcreate, right? Let me recreate that image in the world now. Now that image, that sculpture I make, then that sculpture can then impress because I transfer that builder, that image, into the sculpture through the process of abstraction. Now that sculpture can now impress. So we go to art galleries and we look at David, right? Or we look at this painting by this person, this painting by that person, and they have impressed into their art forms these builders, and now those builders impress themselves on you hundreds of years later, right? And that's done through the abstraction process. So it is not that abstraction in itself is a negative thing. I disagree with Claudius here. I say that it is a massive burden and it is a massive responsibility, but it's not necessarily a negative thing. Now, why isn't it a negative thing? And how that works in more detail, that's what I'm trying to work out because I'm kind of going through Hegel and a few other philosophers, like I said, and pulling from something specific from Thales, and I want to try to build this a little bit better to see this, and not just for like some abstract philosophical speculation like this is cool, but for very practical uses, like I'm trying to apply it here with this whole auto negation in the conspiracy culture.
It also appears to me to be as well that from what I've I've sort of been tepidly reading Claggis's work and um, critiques of him, and also people doing I guess analyses of his work, is that the Geist is this. Again, it's almost like the derealization machine of AI and what have you, where effectively that itself is perhaps eventually the derealization of the builder of God, right? This image of God, um, meaning ourselves, right? Our own soul. But it almost appears to me that the Geist it doesn't have the capacity to compromise, and it's this perpetual and almost frenzied dissection machine. And
Hmm.
I think I don't know to sort, and I do see why Claggis laments about this thing, right? Because for him it's almost like it's like you light a fuse, but you can't put put the spark out, and it's always going to
Right.
get away from you. And I think fundamentally there's no way to harmonize or equalize the Geist, the body, soul, and mind, the Geist and the Zila. But I think you can have a rightful ordering of things. So I think in our current time, I think that you need almost a violent or forceful demotion of the Geist, from where it is now, which is sort of the capacity of a master to that of a servant. And the body and the soul, as you rightly stated, the body is almost um, the ex the tangible expression of the soul, which is the experience part of our being, and the intuition of our being. And so I think fundamentally what you have to do is you have to view the Geist not necessarily as an end in and of itself, or even as a being in and of itself, which is what AI fundamentally is doing. This idea of
Hmm.
artificial intelligence, it's actually attaching beingness to what is a tool fundamentally. I mean, this is very Geistological, and what you need to see it as is a tool. It's like a chainsaw, or a hammer, or a still saw, or what have you. I mean, it has a great deal of utility to it, but it's also very dangerous in the wrong hands. And so it's like any tool, all the way back to to all of our technology, back to fire itself. It's born of friction. It's born of um, it's fueled by this sort of abstract this abstract dead, right? The charcoal or whatever it may be, the kindling. But it can heat us up. It can ensure that we don't die today and that we see the dawn of tomorrow. But, but it can also burn down the entire house, or it can also asphyxiate us.
Mhm.
And that's the problem I think we see with civilization itself. And even, for example, these dialectics that we see, these dogmatic positions, I think is fundamentally, effectively, emanations of this same core problem at the heart of the human condition between, like what you're saying, this lack of harmony, this lack of understanding of our own self, this lack of understanding of how to rightfully order the body, the soul, and the mind. And so we're
Mhm.
locked in this trap. We're constantly looking for a panacea, a cure-all, either in the light or the dark. But people don't realize the dark can blind just as pardon me, the light can blind just as well as the dark.
Mhm.
And so you need a temperance between the two. You need to find that middle point. Otherwise, it will just, for example, if you had a situation where we had no Geist, like what you're saying, it would be death, or it would be something similar. If we were still living, it would be something similar to, say, I don't know, the H.G. Wells' Time Machine. The Morlocks and that of the Eloi. We'd be like the Eloi. We would just be in this docile state. We would just be pure being, but with no ability to produce anything. We'd have no Promethean fire or spirit. There'd be nothing to us. We wouldn't even
Yeah,
have the ability. Yeah,
yeah, it'd be an animal state.
exactly.
It would, yeah, which is Cog is essentially it's essentially says it's sort of like this animalistic state where the world impresses upon you, and you have some kind of instinctive way to process those images and simply react to the images, right? And your body in the world then would react to the images, and it would be this you would be in the flow of the Heraclitean river fully, right? It would just be you would be in the absolute flux. You migrate when you migrate, you mate when you mate, right? It's sort of like oblivion from the position of the
Well,
of our current mindset.
let me ask you this: what do you think this sort of conspiratorial culture, and what we were talking about with the orthodoxy of negation, the auto, the whatever term we want to apply to it, right? What do you think that's more like? Do you think it's more geistological, an extreme geistological expression, or do you believe it's a sort of like what you're saying, this extreme animus, or uh, um, yeah, I will just call it animus or animalistic complex or expression. What do you think? Do you think it's more
The the
geistological?
the conspiracy culture it's itself.
Yeah, just what we've been talking about up to this point. What's your opinions upon it? Obviously, it's taken an extreme position. What extreme position is it taken? Is it locked into a more geistological view of things, or a more zela or animalistic or anima um,
Mhm.
way of being?
Yeah, geistological. I would say. I would say most movements, mass movements in the world, cultural movements and influences in the world are geistological. Now, the driver, the eros for that geistology comes from soul, right? So I guess let's use an example. You watch an Alex Jones documentary, and it's got the eerie music in the background. And Jones is like, blah, 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 blah," and it's the Alex Jones voice, and he's telling you about the Bilderbergs and all this information. And it's edited in such a way to clip in the clips at the right moment. And it's edited in such a way to lead you to a specific revelation of something that is like terrifying and horrifying, right? About what they're doing with the vaccines or what have you. This is not to speak to the truth or falsity of any of the claims, but is the way that it impresses the information upon you. So that stirs up your drive. It stirs up your eros. It stirs up that intensity that hitchhikes onto the information that fuels the ratiocination process of the mind of the guys, right? Where then you then begin, you dot connect and you take that and you dot connect over here and you dot connect over here. And that's sort of driven by this erotic wanting to know. Now, the drive is blind, right? The soul supplying the body and the geist with images is blind. It just supplies what is in its reservoir, right? Of image, of memory, right? If you will. So when you expose yourself to a lot of this information, depending on how the information is given to you, has an effect as well. You see this with religion. Religion will use like certain information. Let's say Christianity. Obviously, I know that best. They're going to take certain information that tags certain um, feelings that you have and drives, and even perhaps builder of like guilt, right? Surrounding this idea of guilt. And then what it'll do is it'll offer you an abstract idea or concept to dissuage that guilt or a cathartic outlet, right? For they get to transfer that guilt to another person, the Christ figure, right? So it's sort of playing off of this the interactions between them. But the conspiratorial movement itself would be, in my opinion, primarily gystological, and that's because it's um, dealing with like pure abstraction for the most part, and then it's dealing with these dichotomies and the dialectics of truth and falsity, right? It is not true that 9/11 happened this way. It is true that 9/11 happened in that way. So it's very much in that gystological territory. And because it's in that territory, it can be a lot of smoke and mirrors. It can be very difficult to discern what's happening because it's sort of purely abstract. If I was there in New York on 9/11 and I saw the plane hit the tower, that's going to be a different level of conviction than if I'm studying about it 25 years later. Or my son's reading about it with some book and his on his iPad at school, right? So it's going to be a different experience. It's going to have a different impression for him. It's going to be it's purely abstract for the most part, right? It's just information, and that information could correspond more or less to reality. I don't know, right? So there's a lot of deception there, and I think it's made to be primarily gystological, so that you can't really put your finger on a whole lot of stuff with a large amount of certainty. Some stuff perhaps you can, but other stuff is like really, really hard to put your finger on it. And what that does then is that makes you very uncertain. And with a level of uncertainty for the common man who isn't, I guess we would say, trained or has not trained his mind in certain understandings, in terms of philosophical understandings, or even we would say maybe perhaps occult understandings, he's going to struggle with not having certainty, yet still being able to participate actively in the world, like with a full conviction, because he doesn't have any certainty. So it becomes like popping a smoke bomb kind of thing. You can't see what's going on, so you feel like you can't act, right? And look, it's a rock and a hard place, like you said. It's like you could be a normie, to use the terminology right, and just believe the narrative. But that leads you to a certain kind of helplessness. But at the same time, you can end up being helpless by an overabundance of information and an inability to find any kind of grounding or conviction. And so you say, I'm just not going to play the game. And then you, in a way of cognitive dissonance, justify to yourself a reason why you shouldn't play the game. Right. And you can even construct a whole system out of this and, call it like Buddhism or something. Right. And it's just be like, well, we're not going to play the game because karma, and we have to like eliminate karmic debt. And so to eliminate karmic debt, you can't participate with any kind of like full conviction about things. You have to just enter into the flow state, and you can build an entire religion over like non-participation. And so, which I think is just fooling yourself. It's just
Wait,
pure
yeah.
illusion. It's
So
more guys. You know.
And exactly. So in a way, it's almost like a faux state of as Clagus would state, like Eros. You feel as though you've smashed the walls of the Geist or the intellect. You've done away with the concepts. What did he call it? Bergriff. But fundamentally, you're still in the Geist. Effectively, because it's still based upon abstraction, and with the conspiratorial culture, thinking about it, it is all based on abstraction. It's all based on the screen. All of these things are
Mhm.
parasocial. They are they're not they're not they don't exist. They don't have their own sort of builder or image, or they don't impress upon you that sort of natural feeling of that sort of eros. But again, it's almost artificial. It stimulates a sort of artificial sense of these things. It's like a synthetic zila, a synthetic soul. Um, so absolutely, so all of even Buddhism is a prime example of that, which is that all of these things are you see in Buddhism and the New Age, just in general. Um, all of it's based upon
Well,
Geist. It's all
yeah,
abstract. It's purely
it
abstract.
is. It is, but now here's the thing though. This is why we are at this like momentous stage in history. I think in the server the other day we were talking about polycrisis, and I said just offhand like, this is the greatest challenge of our time, right? Why? Well, some of the reason for that is that the world now is can be directly participatory regardless of distance because of technology. So if a certain kind of bomb is dropped in the Middle East, it's going to directly affect my gas price here, right? Right. So because there's this instantaneous, almost causative effect over the globe, because the world is economically and technologically absolutely connected now. Now the abstract like deciphering about what's happening isn't just like a pure abstraction, like a monk or a priest in like the 1400s, where Thomas Aquinas just sitting there thinking like literally, right? How many angels can be on the tip of a pen, right? Just a pure abstraction. But now, what the problem is that what before would be super abstract, what are they doing in the Middle East today? I don't know. Doesn't affect me at all. I don't care, right? Let's say like 300 years ago, right? Maybe it'll affect me in like 3 months, but it has no immediacy here. I could be dead by then. I might even be living here now in 3 months. But if something happens in the Middle East in 5 minutes, it can affect everything, like directly, right? Um, so we're at this very difficult time now where we're sort of like forced into being geisty, right? Of employing a geistological disposition if you're going to maintain the um, health or constitution of your body and soul, even for that extent, right? Like you have to pay attention. You can't just take any shot that they want to put in your arm. You have to geistologically abstract and try to look for interstitial causative connections between things in order to navigate that space, right? So we've or sort of have been pushed into this point in history now where you have to get geisty and you have to get like you have to get really geisty with it. There is a level of retreat. I suppose you could still try to find, especially in America, portions of land that are 100 miles away from everybody and just go out there. You might live the rest of your life, or at least this part of it, without having to engage too much. But for 90% of us, we have to like engage. And so it becomes difficult because, again, like you said, finding your center point, and that's a key term because that's going to go right into the next thing I wanted to talk about before. Literally, the center point geometrically, in terms of like having to yes engage with the geist, and we're being sort of like gravitationally sucked towards having to abstract heavily, but we have to keep an anchor in terms of at least some kind of um, balance. We can't go too far to one side. So my position is looking to not only critique a little bit on Clogus, but also like a Landian or accelerationist critique against that position as well, because that position wants full geist, full acceleration.
Yeah.
And so that's that full geist, like the just literally taking that third term, that geistological vector, and pretty much ripping it away from body and soul and having it completely detached and running on its own in an accelerative rate. That's the Landian vision,
Well,
right? Which the tech
it's
guys are
also
taking.
seeking to almost generate its own builder, its own images. Um,
Hmm.
in a sense, I mean, this is of course what AI and LLMs are effectively designed to do. The reason that they become God de facto is firstly because you've mentally terraformed the entire populace, and this is of course accelerated through a globalized society because of the interconnectedness, and of course the internet as well. So it primes
Hmm.
us for accepting all of these now the generations of generative AI as effectively the ultimate images, the ultimate be all and end all images of you could take for anything example anything, right? And what you end up doing is you sort of deify these abstractions as truth, and this is what AI is designed to do almost, um so you get lost in it. It's very similar to Frank Herbert's Dune, and even the other expanded lore surrounding that, especially with the ideas presented. I think it was his son that wrote the expanded universe with the Butlerian Jihad and all of that, and the war against the thinking machines, and even how the thinking machines came about, and also the sort of what does he call it, the sort of techno cults that surrounded these AI gods. And eventually, that basically this is Geist. This is the end all and be all of Landian or Bataillon philosophy, and taken to its logical conclusion. But it again, people have to be almost disarmed and completely. Um, their soul has to be their soul has to be eviscerated effectively.
Hmm.
They have to be nursed from cradle to grave on pure abstractionism. And that brings us back to what your son is learning, syllabus and the curriculum. And of course he's learning about the now the this sort of the modern day psyop of conspiracy culture, which is, funnily enough, no different than the sort of UFO culture of the day. That also made its way into popular culture. And it also was utilized in, for example, the War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, and all of that psyop that was concocted and enacted almost in a universal way across all of America on the radio. And everyone was believing that the UFOs were about to invade, the Martians were about to invade. They were
Hmm.
barricading the roads. They were getting their uh, drying out their powder and preparing for the end of the world. But again, that's because this has been a slow incremental march to this geistological event horizon, and we're almost very, very close to crossing over the point of no return, this
Yeah.
derealization of reality.
Yep. Yeah. And it's. I mean, I get the Landian position where it's like, because this is coming from Kant, because this is what Kant this is what he said, right? He's the whole Kantian project is to show that you don't have contact with the world, like directly through your mind, through your geist. You don't have the contact because it's all by abstraction, right? It's that there's a processing or buffer zone that takes place in terms of the restraints, the constraints on your mind, what you're able to think and not think. These determine how that world is filtered through in terms of the dialectical or rational processing, right? So it's derealized, and this is what the death of God is. This is why Nietzsche said God is dead, right? And we have killed him. What he's really talking about, it's what Nietzsche is saying is that um, through this derealization process, essentially, you cannot have direct contact with God anymore. But before Kant, they thought you can have direct contact. Nobody thought to think, right, that like, hey, wait a minute, like we abstract from the world, which means we're like removed from the world, and we're reading this Bible, which is full of propositions, which are abstract ideas, and this is actually a buffer, right, between us and God. It's how God has chosen to communicate through us, is what the religions communicate to us. But that doubt sort of creeps in, where it says, well, how do we know we're interpreting it correctly, right? And so that's the Kantian critique, and Kant sort of realizes this, and that's why God dies after that, because there's this forever barrier between us and God. And Claudius is essentially saying the same thing. He's just saying the whole world, there's a barrier between us and the whole world, and that's because of the Geist. That's why Claudius says, he uses a very specific illustration. He says body and soul are polar, connected in terms of like a bipolar connection between the two. And then from outside, there's that Landian term, right? The outside, right? The noumena, the Kantian noumena, the outside of our mind. From the outside, the spirit inserts itself between the body and soul like a wedge. He says, he uses that term. It wedges in between body and soul. So that's putting up like a barrier between the images and how it affects you in like the world. And that's the intellect, that abstract process that goes through that process, right? So is that inherently a negative thing? That's my question, right? Um, is that geistological position um, inherently negative, or can it be used for a positive sense? It's a tool, right? Like you mentioned, it's fire. It's the Promethean fire. You can burn down a building. You can cook food. You can cauterize a wound. You can fend off a predator. You can do all kind of stuff with fire. Is fire inherently bad, right? Or is the use of fire, as we have seen it through 95% of human history, the problem, right? Where it leans too much on the geistological side so heavily, it becomes autoproductive, and it starts sort of floating away from the body and soul and detaching itself because of its inherent power to affect the world through abstraction.
Hmm.
Um, we chase that power and look for a total dominance over the world. And like Gandalf says, to bring a little bit of Lord of the Rings, I am a servant of the secret fire, not the master of the secret fire. Not I'm going to use the secret fire to become the Lord of all, but I serve the secret fire because there is no final resolution to like the dialectic of the contradiction. There's always a remainder that Geist can never get its hands around, as I've said before. So
Yeah, it's very similar to, to bring this to the allegory of the cave, and this sort of rounds out our discussion, which is that, as Clagus mentioned, that the Geist, eventually will devour the soul, right? And you'll have that inversion between master and servant. And again, it's almost Nick Land, and George Bataille, and what have you. All of those of the Dark Enlightenment, that sort of a little fun club of the Tech Bros. They they're actually, in fact, no different to those who would oppose Geist, who who would oppose it as purely a negative. I mean, Nick Land and George Bataille, similar to Clagus, though Clagus is more direct. Nick Land and Bataille are almost implicitly stating that the Geist is a negative. It's just they choose to surrender to it.
yes, no.
It's very peculiar when you look at it like that. So and the
Well,
problem is
well,
that,
well, 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 but
yeah,
Bataille
jump
wants
in.
to try to get beyond it. Yeah, Bataille wants to try to get beyond it. His whole thing is chasing like limit experiences to try to like break the hold of Geist, right? And
Mhm.
Land does that initially in like the 90s, but then he realizes, or from his perspective at least, he realizes that um, there's no stopping this, right? This is the evolutionary trajectory of humanity, and there's no going back. There's no exit from the rail. We are railroaded in. So that's why he's such a determinist, and he's big on Calvinism now, right? The tradition I come out of, and what have you. Um, um, and that's because he sees it as the future is absolutely determined. Um, and so the future isn't contingent. And this is why I'm a little bit more, well, maybe a heretical interpretation of Hegel, but I see the future as contingent, as open to freedom and possibility. Land wants no freedom. Land's whole thing is, right? He says we're meat puppets for the outside, for pure intelligence, right? And we're going to build pure intelligence. Pure intelligence will move beyond the human, and it'll become this endless, productive machine of intelligence throughout the universe, right? So there's sort of this Kurzweilian idea too of like, hey, let's send nanobots and AI to other planets so that they can do the same thing over there, right? Kind of thing. So it's this idea of spreading throughout the universe, all space, pure this sort of like pure hyper intelligence, and having that hyper intelligence dominate all life in a very cold sense. Coldness
And
be my god, right?
and
So
this itself is so hyperstition itself comes out of the Geist because as Clagus states with that concept of tact as opposed to rhythmus, which is an expression of the Zila, which is more
mhm.
along the lines of analog. It's an organic sort of flowing, unpredictable pulse of of the soul of nature itself. In the tax, which is I believe it means the sort of a metric beat.
Mhm.
This is the opposite. So it's a more mechanical. It's sort of it's predictable. It's identical. It's also
It's
repetitive,
constrained. Yeah, it's
constrained. Yeah.
constrained because that's what makes the repetitive beat. This is what
Mm,
Cloggis is talking about. Like the rhythm is that this is his whole view on the will. Cloggis sees the will in man as restrictive. It's not like determinative in terms of like an affirmative thing. It's restrictive. So when you say I'm going to go to the gym today, that's a restriction on life. Why? Because Cloggis says the flow of life is a rhythm where you are spontaneously reacting, almost like a dance, with how the day goes. If you end up at the gym, you end up at the gym. But you are not going to say, damn it, I'm tired. It's cold outside. I don't want to get up. You restrain your will and focus it into a point. The illustration he uses is a marksman. And he talks about how in order to aim your rifle at a point, let's say 100, 200 yards away, is that you have to use your will as you look down the sights or the optics, the telescope. And if you look down that telescope, you'll see the crosshairs dancing and bouncing and shaking all over the place. And he says that's because the life within you wants to move. And so your heartbeat, your nervous system, your musculature wants to either be in a relaxed state or wants to flow in a certain state, but you have to put it in a certain position as you hold the rifle, squeeze it tight, hold it tight. You're holding the life force and directing it and restraining it in a certain position to aim the mark, to aim the sights on the mark to try to be as accurate as you can for the trajectory of the bullet. So you're restraining the flux of life through your will. See, Geist for Cloggis isn't just pure abstraction intellect. It is the intellect as it has a direct relation and control over the will in the world, right? So, and he sees the will as constraining, not explosive. It's not affirmative in terms of I'm going to go do this. When you make a choice to go
so
do
it's
something,
subtractive then.
it's subtractive. You're eliminating what you would otherwise naturally do,
So
right?
so so to round off this this whole entire discussion on the whole auto hoax or auto debunk or the orthodoxy of negation within conspiratorial culture, it must be of the Geist because fundamentally, even the idea of the non-participation in these things, firstly, you must load, if you will, the concepts, the idea of the event itself, the psyop, whatever it may be, into your mind. You then must analyze it in some way to
Hmm.
come to that non-participatory stance as you believe it. Of
Exactly.
course, it's false, but as well, it's also subtractive. So eventually it will just leave a vacuum, like what you were mentioning with the allegory of the scope. Eventually it just the entire teleology and the sort of emotional end game of that non-participatory impulse is to bring about the non-shaking of the scope, to
Hmm.
have pure intellectual superiority, to pierce the veil of life itself. But ultimately it's just almost it's a hubristic, false, like false heaven or false paradise or false. It itself is a sort of simulation of the mind. It doesn't exist. It's just pure. Yeah, it's pure abstractionism, right? It's born out of this. It's born out of these impulses. But fundamentally, people continue to be blindsided by these sort of deep, innate, ingrained, sort of responses within their own human condition because they don't even understand themselves. So if they don't
Hmm.
understand themselves, they're going to fall foul to all of these things, uh, be it the ultimate psyop, which would appear to be the weaponized disbelief,
Hmm. Yeah, because and that's why I said earlier in the conversation, non-participation is participation. You
Yeah.
just haven't thought deeply enough about it yet. You haven't examined interiorly, in an interior sense, what's happening. I am geistologically abstracting this whole process and using my will to choose non-participation. Even if you feel you should participate, you're saying, nah, that's a deception. I'm not going to play the game. Well, that's just using Geist and will to non-participate. So you're still participating in Geist and will, right? That's why all the monks who are up in the monasteries meditating, they are having to constrain themselves through this idea, this Geistological idea that like, hey, we should meditate and not go out and like take shots of liquor and just hang out with our buddies and talk shit or whatever, right? Like we need to go in the monastery and meditate. Well, that's just as Geistological as the doctrine of the Trinity and people worshiping in church on Sunday. It's just as Geistological as Peter Thiel's ideas of this and that. It's all the same thing, kind of thing, right? It's just everyone is just sort of choosing whatever flavor that they find acceptable to themselves, right? So
Hmm.
and so here's the thing: the more and the deeper you think on this, as I'm trying to do, you see, that's the soul trap, if you will, is that there is no non-participation. The soul trap isn't so much about like reincarnation. The soul trap is like there's no non-participation. Anything you do because you're a conscious being is going to be
It's
geistologically
it's
influenced.
it's a toroidal field, isn't it? I think this almost touches upon the idea of the big apple, if you will,
Hmm.
of Genesis, which is you have the tree of life, which is a non-participatory system, but it's also a system of indeterminacy. Therefore, it's just a sort of nothingness. It's an ein. It is literally God itself, a pure potential resting within a primordial stasis. And then, of course, they ate from the tree. They realized their own nakedness, right? Their own source of zila, right? And again, it started to abstract. They started to put onto the image their own sort of their own projections. And so this ties in with the fruit or the apple of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This polarity, the polarity itself, the sort of primordial struggle. And so the reason for the apple, well, the reason in the modern day it's been turned into an apple. Hebrew had a similar illustrative play on words with the fruit. I forget the Hebrew word now, but the apple is basically the toroidal field if you cut it in half and look at the profile of it. Why the toroidal field? Because, well, it's firstly the battalion mouth to anus solar axis. That itself is basically an enclosed loop. It's an
Hmm.
energetically, hermetically sealed system. It's like what you're saying. It doesn't matter if you can choose non-participation, but you're effectively still going to be subsumed into the system as a data point to just use sort of a computer terminology there. But um, I wanted to, do you have enough time for one more question? Just a quick question, and we'll. If I
Yeah,
don't
if
know.
you make it real quick, yeah, I get a
Yeah.
let's knock it
So
out. Yeah.
Clagus mentioned this agape, which is this sort of unconditional, almost spiritualized love. This concept of love in Greek is often a tool of Geist. It is an abstract conceptual command. This idea that we see in the New Age of, quote, you must love everyone equally as a moral duty. You also see it in religions as well. Um, that itself, how do you see societies and systems? Why do they use those types of those types of abstract conceptual commands, right? Of course, they make you feel good. They're almost a virtue signal in and of itself. But how does that sort of draw you in further into the geistological trap? And moreover, as well, is this part of this same sort of um, faux or pardon me, false sense of the soul that you feel like you're connecting with the soul, but ultimately you're actually connecting with a mere abstraction, this geistological conceptual command. Do you have anything to say on that, just briefly?
Um, can you be a little more specific, like in terms of um, like these very like generalized statements, like love everybody or something like
Yes, well,
can you be a
well,
little
well.
more
For
detailed?
example, in the New Age, they say that everything is love. The only way to escape everything is to,
Oh,
become love. And this idea, this weird abstract concept that we have now in the modern day of love. Do you think this ties back with the Geist? And do you have anything to mention upon that?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it definitely can. When you get like these like overgeneralized statements, like you always have to be careful with that. I mean, because uh, life is multiple, right? There's a multiplicity to everything. There's all these different perspectives vying to have their perspectives manifest in the world as an event, right? Um, and so there's all these different perspectives. When you say things like the answer is love, love and light, and or what have you, it's really vague. But you have to. What they're asking you to do is to sort of reach beyond that Dunbar limit and like love everybody and everything. But it's highly abstract because your body and soul has no connection to those things, right? Like what you have to love the man who's in Mongolia right now on a steep doing X, Y, or Z. I have never seen the man. I've never interacted with the man. My body has no connection to him. My soul has no connection to him. I don't have any impression of him. You can show me a Mongolian man. You can show me the steps. You could show me what he might be doing or look like, but it is not him. So I get no immediate impression of him. So then the only other sphere for me to interact with him is purely in a geistological way, right? Because there's no body soul interaction there. So again, here we are, totally asymmetrically disbalanced on one side of this equation here of this pure Geist, whether you have to love everybody and everything. This is the Bodhisattva, right, in
Hmm.
Buddhism, where they give themselves to everybody and everything. But it's like if they have no, now you are connected to that man, right? We would say like there's going to be some kind of connection, but the connection, this interaction between all the events that are constantly happening, the trillions and trillions of events that are happening in the world, because everything is in a causal relationship. It's in relation to everything else. But here again, we get back to the beginning of that conversation. You're not aware of that interstitial relation,
Mm.
and that interstitial relation cannot be established um, with your body and soul. So only a portion of your being, the most abstract, non what's the word like worldly or time centered part of yourself, the deepest part of yourself, if you will,
Hmm.
uh, they can't
There's a
interact with him.
so basically Klagos's Eros would be a rejection of this because it's based around specificity. It's based around that. You have to. It's like what you're saying. It can't be universal. It's
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's
That's what I was
it's,
going to get to, because
mhm.
Eros is that magnetic connection that works through the builder, through the soul, to connect your body to it. Right, right. So But now here, this is where I get in a little bit of a tussle with Cloggis. I said, well, what about the Geist? Are we just going to ignore the Geist? Because if you, through Eros, the builder comes and connects your body and soul to it, what happens to the Geist? He's just sitting over there in the corner. How does the Geist interact when Eros rules? Right? Cloggis, in his Cosmogonic Eros, I think that's the last line he puts. I got it downstairs. I'd have to go get it. But I'm upstairs now. But he says, would that Eros would reign, he who engendered it all, or something like that. And that's like the cosmos, right? And if Eros reigns, then the vector through the soul into the body and the Geist then has we're sort of like bringing it back to the center, where the engine that runs the whole thing, which is Eros, has more of a primary seat, and it's not
Yeah.
so much pushed away for the Geist to have the full seat. Now we need asymmetry. See, this is where I'm going to get a little bit off from Cloggis, maybe, but where I'm like, we need an asymmetry because then we have a static relation, and I'll show you this when I diagram this out for you. Like I said, I'm trying to put this together. Is that you end up with a static relation, or you can end up with this sort of static relation where there's no directionality. You need some asymmetry, so you need that third term, because the third term brings in asymmetrical relations. It's what allows for difference, is a third term, and because this is Hegel, right? Thesis, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis,
Well,
right? So the
it's also
third
every
term,
creation myth known to man as well. This tria
right?
prima. Yeah.
Right, right. So I think the third term is necessary. The third term is painful, burdensome, heavy responsibility, but I think the third term is necessary. So I depart a little bit from Cloggis in that sense. Maybe I'm wrong. I like to. I'm open again to be correct on that, but I'm seeing a bit of a departure there, because it's like, well, you kind of just have this Geist, which is just like attached to us, calls it basically a parasite, and you just like ignore it and just try to pursue Eros. And like, well, clearly that's not how life works. It works that way in small moments, right? When you're standing in front of the ocean, when you're with someone you love, when you're, you know, being chased by a bear, whatever it is, in those small moments, that's when it's like the guy sort of like shuts off or goes into recedes into the background. But if you live your life constantly, or try to live your life constantly in that state, you usually die pretty quickly, right? And now here's the thing: Cloggis is going to say, well, that's not a problem, and I do agree. But then Cloggis will also talk about like the heroic aspect of mankind, and when you're alive and embodied, this goes back to other stuff we talked about being embodied, how everything wants to be embodied. When you're embodied, your ability to be moved by Eros is much greater, right? Because you are in a body, and there is that interstitial causative and effect relationship that Eros uses to flux the world and cause the world to be in this interconnected relational space with everything else, right? Um, but yeah, these sort of like love everybody and all these sort of like very blanket terms are just usually purely abstract, because the body and soul really has no relation. You would have to have direct relation with all 8 billion humans, or however many there are, and that's probably not going to happen, right? So what it really is that I will fiercely love, or whatever the interaction is, with those whom I have a body, soul, and Geist connection with, that Trinity, right? And so then out of the fullness of my being, I can love them. But if you're telling me to love them purely through Geist, we're in trouble, because you are decentering this perspective, this circle, and by decentering it, you're going to limit. Um, if you decenter it for too long, you're going to limit certain possibilities. And I'm going to
Definitely.
try to diagram this for you in the future, where we can try to see what I'm talking about. Um, but you can end up limiting options very
Hmm.
restrictively if you only do it in a geistological sense. And we see that with accelerationism. This is the singularity,
Yes.
where it's this deterministic idea where all there's no contingency, there's no possibility for escape. It's all coming down to an omega point, which means that the circle has been decentered
Yes.
and it's pulling too much in one direction. It's not that the direction that it's going in is necessarily negative. That's my thing. That's where I'm like, hold on, Pelagus, hold on. It's not necessarily that it's negative. But if it sort of railroads into that one specific point and all other possibilities are eliminated, then yes, I agree. That's a problem. And that's what we're dealing with right now. So that has to be addressed. And I guess to close off the conversation, you're going to address it no matter what you try to do because you have to participate. So we need to sort of figure these things out so that we can participate in a sovereign and hopefully effective state. And we can participate in that Heraclitean war that he uses, that strife. And what he means by that is the multiple perspectives of each individual being in the world as we engage body, soul, and spirit interconnected with each other as we engage and vie for our soul to express itself onto other souls and those souls to express themselves onto our souls, and in my particular view, right, with the Geist assisting in that process.
But in
So
the
yeah.
framework of exclusivity and specificity, rather than this sort of weird abstract, well, to pick a neologism, that of inclusivity. So all of that is surrounding the sort of universal and the geistological. It's something I just
Right.
wanted to ask because it was something that was sort of in my mind regarding that.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
well, well yeah. Last
yeah,
point. When you do that, by the way, is that you lose all power. You can't actually
exactly.
affect.
It's
You
like
can't
what you're
actually
saying,
affect
that
anything. Yeah.
the you lose the possibilities because the circle is decentered effectively, so it
Yeah.
loses all potency. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so you chase a phantom of like love for every single person in the world, like the Bodhisattva vow, right? You chase this phantom of being able to do that because you chased it so far into this one geistological corner, it eliminates any possibilities to really have much of an effect. So you kind of like burn out. It's like quantity over quality, right? You can't actually affect anything because it's just purely in this abstract space, and there's not enough body and soul in it to actually affect the world. Because Geist doesn't affect the world. Geist orients you to affect the world with your body and soul,
And that
right?
explains the death throes of neoliberalism at present,
Hmm.
effectively.
Right,
Man, I
right.
really appreciate the generosity of your time, and I do apologize if this went a bit beyond the anticipated time frame, but I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's okay. It's just that's the flux, and we'll just adapt and roll with it. So,
And when you get all of this together and you can diagram it out, we'll head on to StreamYard and we can do a presentation on this because I'd be really interested to hear this
sure,
in greater
sure.
depth.
Yeah, definitely, man.
Right, man. Have a good one. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Yeah, you too. You too. Have a good night.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
All right, later.